Okay. I will do my best. Well, I thought I would do my best, but my notes aren't loading. I'll do my best to get through everything tonight. I do have to leave right at 10, so maybe I'll try to get done a little early. Who am I kidding? I'm not even planning these. I just go. But all right, let me see. I'm trying to find the last thing we did. Scrolling down. I don't think we got to aggression. I think we finished with stereotypes. Yep. Okay. So we had just finished with stereotypes, right? We're talking about all these different patterns that conserve effort and that help us understand the world, because there is no way to understand the millions of things you see in a day without taking a few shortcuts, which unfortunately tend to make people in marginalized social positions have worse fates. The next thing we're going to talk about is aggression, which is a little bit less about, cognitive heuristics and a little bit more about just biological inclination. So, aggression is our big header. We have different types of aggression, and we can put it on two spectra. So you can almost think of it as like a graph of sorts. So I'll do that particular illustration. So on one hand, your aggression can be hostile or instrumental. So you could have hostile or instrumental, right? That being the y-axis of our graph here. Hostile aggression would be purely just lashing out. You're not trying to accomplish anything by being aggressive. You're just having a bad day and, something bad happens. Someone cuts you off on the sidewalk and you lash out because of that. Instrumental aggression is aggression designed to secure some other end. Best example is an armed robbery. It's very aggressive, if you couldn't tell, but it's also you're not doing it just for the sake of lashing out. You're doing it because you want the money. The second axis here, our x-axis, can be indirect, which I'll just abbreviate as in. So indirect or direct. All right, cool. So direct aggression is the in-your-face personal aggression. This is stereotyped to guys. I don't do guy stereotypes well, but this is like the, puffing your chest, walking up, you want to go, bro, kind of thing, right? You can't even see my pec, so it doesn't work. But that's the idea of a direct aggressive incident, is like you are getting right up in someone's face, telling them that you think they suck, right? And guys, stereotypes, not necessarily, well, often, but there's definitely a social pressure and a social expectation that guys participate in this kind of aggression. Indirect aggression, the stereotyped or at least expected of females, is the more backstabbing, subtle aggression. So instead of, actively throwing haymakers, it's more of a, making snide comments behind your back. You can see how you could be, you could be in a middle area where you're being passive aggressive to someone's face, right? It's not just one or the other. And the same thing with hostile instrumental. Like you could be angry because you want somebody to stop talking, but you probably wouldn't want that. You wouldn't try to shame them into stopping talking if you weren't so angry to begin with, right? So you can imagine, that's why I like the graph metaphor. But yeah, you get the idea. Okay, so where does aggression come from? There's a whole number of hypotheses as to its origin. The first is this Dollard? I don't know how you say it. Frustration aggression hypothesis. Okay. So frustration aggression. And this means that your aggression is the result of having your goal-oriented behavior defeated. So frustration actually comes from the Latin frustra, which literally means in vain. And what this means is that you are only angry when some kind of goal-directed behavior fails. For example, I wanted to do a little bit of work between 2 p.m. and 5 p.m. today. I went on my phone for 3 hours straight, and now I'm pissed off. Don't ask where I got that example from, but that's the idea, is that you can't have aggression outside of this, right? So If you're a guy at the club, somebody gets in the way of the girl you're trying to talk to, you go all, want to go, bro, kind of thing. That's the idea. You have some kind of goal that's being frustrated, and because your efforts are in vain, you lash out. The better version comes from this guy named Berkowitz. I don't think you really need to know how to spell it, but it's that. Oh, TZ, not CZ. But his idea is reformulated frustration aggression. So these are, in classic intro psych style, these are terms that mean very different things but are easy to confuse, even though they mean very different things. So what this Berkowitz guy is saying is that any unpleasant experience leads to aggression. Excuse me. Any unpleasant experience leads to being aggressive. So it's not just your goal-oriented behavior that fails. Maybe you skipped a meal and now you're dealing with the fact that you are hungry. Well, you don't necessarily have to have a goal of hitting every 3 meals a day for the negative experience of hunger to evolve into hanger, right? Hence aggression. So this one, the reformulated one, is a lot better when you think about it, because there's no way that just frustration of goal-oriented behavior can be responsible for everything that we see. But they're both terms you need to know. Another model is this general affective aggression model. So, general affective. So this one takes things in a slightly different direction than the other ones. So in this case, right, especially Dollard, but also Berkowitz, tries to pin aggression on one specific feeling. So in Dollard's case, it's that your goals are frustrated. In Berkowitz's case, it's just any kind of negative feeling, but like the specific negative energy, especially frustration, right? So general affective aggression model, it's one of those things where psychologists take something that makes sense and then make it make less sense by putting words in front of it. So I will put the words up there, but then I will explain what the words mean. So don't worry. So it's this 3-step model that considers your input variables, right? Okay, what does that mean? I'll get there. So input variables, internal processes, and behavior. So, oh, my marker's fading. This makes me angry. My goal of writing is not working. What does this mean? Well, this is just a really fancy and smart person way of saying something that you could say really simply. Input variables. You have specific factors that you are noticing that are coming at you. So this could be, right, social. You are being rejected by somebody you just asked out. That would be the social input variable. Or it could be personal. I am hungry. Situational, right? I'm in a job interview and that puts me on edge. All these kinds of things. You could talk about the terms, but I think it makes more sense. This is just your environment at the time, the input variables. It's a very computerized way of thinking. So the input is whatever is around you. Internal processes. So, okay, we have arousal, emotion, and cognition. So the idea is that you have a certain internal state at the time that these external states are operating. So arousal, are you on edge? Are you really like wired, hyped up? Or are you more sleepy and tired? Emotion, that's self-explanatory. You know what emotion is. And cognition, what are you thinking about right now? And all 3 of those factors can be different from situation to situation. And all 3 of those factors change the way that you process, hence the term internal processes, your input variables. All this is saying is that if you are angry, you're going to think of the environment differently than you will if you're really content. You just got a great grade in test or something like that. That's all this is saying, but then they make it sound, yeah. Behavior. Basically, this just means, do you see aggressive behavior? This is like the output of the model. Do you see the aggressive behavior or not? That's all it is. It's like a mathematical function. You're taking in input variables. You're doing something based on how you feel at the time, and it's an output. So it's very computerized. But general affective aggression model. That's actually everything that I have on aggression. Next up is some stuff on personality, but I want to stop. I want to see if this orange marker works because my black one's running out. Can you guys see that? It looks really light, so I'm going to assume no. But second off, this would be the time to ask any questions you have. But if not, I will continue. Oh, some of you are unmuted, so I want to give you an opportunity to say something if you needed to, or if you're just trying to say, Joey, the marker doesn't work, then.
I had just a quick question about clarifying Dollar's theory and Benquist's theory. Basically, do they just, like, I know Dollar's theory talks about how frustration leads to aggression, but do both theories put emphasis on frustration and how that leads to aggression?
So Dollards, if I think about emphasis, right, or hypothetically, if you had a multiple choice question about aggression or frustration, I would immediately go to Dollards. Berkowitz's idea is that any negative emotion can, but that frustration is certainly one of those and one of the more common ones.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, but there's no emphasis of frustration in terms of Berkowitz's theory. It's just one of the factors, the negative emotions that leads to aggression.
Yeah. Yeah. No, now that I think about it, I remember when I mentioned that. Yeah, that's an important distinction to make. Think of Berkowitz as a more general one, and Dollards is the one that's very tunnel vision, just zeroes in on frustration. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Okay. In that case, I will do my best to avoid the glare spot here, and we can get to our next big header, which is personality. So, okay, we talked about aggression seems to be this almost biological process, this almost inevitable process, right? Something that happens in an almost computerized way. A very predictable set of inputs and outputs. Personality is something a little bit more, a little bit harder to pin down. Hold on, my computer's about to run out of battery, so I don't want to do that. That would be kind of awkward. There we go. Okay. Um, but personality is something that's a little bit harder to computerize. A lot of cognitive and psychological processes have been quite successfully computerized. But what really is personality, and how could you quantify that? So to answer the first question, a definition of personality, I'm just going to type out in the chat because I think that's easier than me just repeating it. So I encourage you to take this down, but then I'm actually going to talk about it because I don't think it's enough just for you to have a definition. Oh, that's not how you spell context, Joey, but I think you get the point. That is like your formal back of the psychology book definition of personality. So while you're writing that down, I want to highlight a few things that are salient in this, that are important. Enduring. So this is not something that personality is not something that you express in one instance and then don't express in another. So if you're angry because you're hungry, but you're not really angry when you're well fed, I wouldn't call you say that you have an angry personality, right? It's not an enduring behavior. But if you have a personality where, regardless of your biological state of satiety, you're angry, right? It endures across different contexts, different behaviors, different times, then I'm much more likely to say you have an angry personality. Patterns of thought, feeling, motivation, and behavior. Okay, well, there's your ABCs again: affect, behavior, cognition. The idea being that personality is not just what your emotional state is like or what you tend to think about, it's something much more all encompassing. When we talk about the ABCs, we tend to be talking about every facet of a thing that individuals express in different contexts. That's kind of what I said about how often are you angry, right? So the idea is you'd be expressing similar things in markedly different contexts. That would be something that would bring about a personality as opposed to a passing event, right? So we touched on this a little bit when we were talking about that like covariation theory, where we were trying to pin down, is this the type of thing, or is this specific thing something that a person does all the time, right? You have an intuitive sense that you have to do something a lot or feel a certain way a lot to have this condition. You get it. So how do we study personality? Here we have another one of our little spectra. You could take an idiographic approach, or a nomothetic approach. All right, so this is really a methodological rather than a psychological idea. An idiographic approach is a study of individual people trying to figure out what makes this particular research subject that you find so interesting unique. Ideo shares a root with words like idiosyncrasy and idiot that come from the Greek for isolated or alone. The story of idiot's a little, but in like the 1800s, it was considered an object of being alone. You don't need to know that. That's just a way to remember idiographic, right? Illustration of the alone, the individual, the indivisible atom, that kind of thing. Nomothetic, you might guess, is the exact opposite. You're trying to study large groups of people and find common themes. So if you're doing an idiographic approach, you are looking for what makes this person unique. If you're doing a nomothetic approach, you're saying what makes all of these people have more common ground than they might expect. All right. The next question would be, how do you measure personality? Or as I'm going to artlessly put, how measure? There's two categories of personality measurements or tests or that kind of thing that have seen widespread use in psychology. So the first is this idea of the projective measure. And I think the best way to illustrate this is to give you the two examples and then illustrate the common themes. Be nomothetic about this. The thematic apperception test, or TAT, as I will call it, is a test where a subject or somebody receiving therapy is given an ambiguous drawing, an ambiguous situation. They're basically put in a situation where there's a lot of blanks that their mind can fill in. And you ask the subject or patient to explain what's going on. And the interpreter of the test can derive from patterns of the explanation specific aspects of that person's personality. So, for example, somebody who is a huge sports fan might be given the vague story of, oh, well, a 17-year-old and his friends are all walking home from a night out. Maybe the sports guy who has a sportsy personality is likely to say that, oh, they were coming back from playing pickup basketball or something like that, right? The idea being that another person might say they were coming back from extracurriculars at school, right? That kind of thing. So what you read into it says a lot about your personality, what you expect, how you lived your life. The second one is very similar, and this is well known, the Rorschach test. And I have kind of a lisp, so I'm going to spell this out so you can actually spell it correctly. The Rorschach test, also known as the ink blot test. It's very similar to the TAT. All you're doing is you're giving somebody just a literal blot of ink. It would be like if I ripped apart this marker so that it exploded, saw whatever ink happened to fall on here, and hopefully not my computer, and then said, tell me what you see. Same deal, trying to draw patterns of tendency from explanations of ambiguity. And in both cases, right, so they're really both very similar. You could use the same term for both of them, but that would raise the averages in your intro psych class, so they don't like doing that. Basically, the common theme I want to emphasize is that you're also kind of measuring the personality of the examiner, because each examiner could have their own bias, right, in how they interpret these things. It's not an objective procedure to say what it means that somebody drew a basketball correlation, because one interpreter might just say, oh, well, this person is much more likely to be a big sports guy. Another person might say, oh, well, this person's much more likely to come from a low-income neighborhood where basketball is the hangout of choice, as opposed to, I don't know, parties or extracurriculars, right? There's a lot of different ways you could read into the same response, just as there's a lot of different responses that you can read from the same ambiguous scenario. So honestly, these tests, don't tell Andre I said this, but these tests are kind of shit. Like, they really don't tell you that much, but they're still in use sometimes, and it can tell you a lot about yourself, how you read into these things. On the other hand, there are the objective measure tests of personality. So we talked about the projective, where the subject projects something. Now we have the objective. And I'm also going to write this one out because I feel like it's going to be inefficient if I, with my weird little speech impediment, try to do it. There you go, Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. So this is just a huge test. I think it's something like 500 questions. Like, hopefully you know what it's like to try to get bonus points in psych. That seems to be a thing of the past. But what it's like to sit through one of those questionnaires, right, where you have like 80 terms and it takes 35 minutes. Now imagine doing like 500. It's kind of out there, but the idea is you are forming these really rigorous quantitative subscores of a person's personality on as many levels as you can. And you're using this, it's kind of like an AP test. So you may not have an overall score, but you have your, AB Calc subscore or your pre-colonial history APUSH subscore, something like that. The idea being is that you have these like really quantitative measurements. You don't have examiner bias because a 5 is standardized for every examiner, but you can't necessarily say that two people who give the same answers really have the same underlying personality. So, okay, you don't have the level of subjectivity that the projective tests had, but you also have the issue now of how do we know what the perfect measure of personality is? Any bureaucratized test will have this issue. Okay, next we get to talk about these ideas behind personality. And I wish I didn't have to say this at home because my parents are here and my brother is here, but we get to talk about the weird Freud stuff for a really long time. Moment of silence for me later. Hopefully y'all are wearing headphones. But we also have a little bit of before we get into that. So before we go into like the psychosexual stages and all that, we could just put down a general description of his psychodynamic theory. Because in this case, there's actually quite a few insights in the psychodynamic aspect. So when Freud's analyzing a person's personality, right, for therapy, for history, whatever, he's analyzing the role of the unconscious, right, what you don't see, and of childhood events, the unconscious and childhood events. So his assumption is really quite counter to the time. This is like, late 1800s. Europe just went through its Enlightenment 100 years ago, and there's this idea of the rational animal, right? John Stuart Mill helped develop marginal utility around this time, along with Ricardo. So economics is booming. We have this idea that human beings are rational animals whose thought processes are largely limited to what they consciously ponder. Freud says, okay, well, it's hard to be rational when you have this unconscious that, by definition, your consciousness can't control. and that your child, that two people who had different childhood events won't think of philosophy the same way, right? The idea being it's an inherently irrational system. So at the time, this is pretty revolutionary, and this is why we still talk about Freud today. Unfortunately, he took it way too far, and then we get to talk about psychosexual stages later. So not everything can be a winner, but that's the world. Before we get into that aspect, we have this topographic model of mental processes. Topographic model. What does that mean? Okay. So this is a much more this is a Freudian model. It's a way to think of Freud, but it's really very similar, but has some small differences. So you have three parts here that contribute to the mind. You have the conscious, okay, go figure, Freud. So you have the conscious, the unconscious. Hopefully you saw that one coming. And then the third term, the pre-conscious. So the conscious, the unconscious, and the pre-conscious. And the idea is that these are three systems, these three consciousnesses are all working, and they kind of live their own lives. They're each like mini yous, like the Disney movie Inside Out, right? So instead of having like joy and sadness and anger and disgust and fear, you have this rational, goal-oriented, consciously aware conscious, right? So, you have the irrational, oft repressed unconscious, and the preconscious, which is kind of like a doorway or gateway between the two. So, especially when the conscious and the unconscious are disagreeing, you get a tension builds, and that tension that builds is what this topographic model is claiming causes anxiety. An example being, you do something you knew you shouldn't have done. You keep rationalizing it to yourself consciously using your goal-oriented conscious. It wasn't that bad, right? I was just in a bad mood. That's not who I am, or that was drunk me, something like that. You're trying to rationalize away. Your unconscious keeps feeling this upswell of shame, though. You have this tension, and because of that tension, because the two are disagreeing, you can't resolve the issue. And what this topographic model would argue is that you should change the conscious so that it aligns with your unconscious. Yeah, I did that. Yeah, it wasn't good. Okay, let's move on, So that's the key idea of this topographic model, which is Freudian, but not like super Freudian, if that makes sense. I mean, it has the same idea. The emphasis on the unconscious is Freudian. Next up, also Freudian, is the drive instinct model. So we were treating people like computers before. Now we're treating them as even simpler computers that just happen to be really rational for a few things and really irrational about everything else. So the idea here is that, again, there's conflict between this conscious rational discourse and an unconscious instinct or an unconscious drive. In this case, what we're really saying is that the instinct takes over. The instinct is what we listen to ultimately. Again, when the two conflict, there's tension. But the emphasis of this model is that instinct is really, really, really important to explaining human behavior. Freud also had, in this idea, Freud's fundamental drives are these eros and thanatos. Eros, or eros, depending on who you ask, is Freud's term for the innate drive to seek pleasure and avoid pain. It's not necessarily erotic in the sense of sexual, but certainly that's a way to seek pleasure and avoid pain, right? But this is like a fundamental drive to make your lot in life more pleasurable, less painful. That's actually quite in accord with what utilitarian philosophy at the time was saying. But then you have this Thanatos. If you take out the AT, you get the Marvel villain, which is not terribly coincidental. You have the self-destructive drive for death. Freud thinks that there is a human desire to off oneself, and that it's really not popular to want to off yourself. So when it's socialized, when you can't really feel that way about yourself, so aggression comes. If I can't off myself, I'm going to harm other people. And we accepted this for 60 years. I think that's kind of funny. But that's Freud's second fundamental drive. Now, at the same time, the Earth is on fire because of climate change. Maybe we have a collective Thanatos, and he was right the whole time. But that's not what we're here in Intro Psych to talk about. All right. So next up, we have our developmental model of libidinal drive. Okay. Developmental model of libidinal drive. So this is where Freud's psychosexual stages come in. And this is where I will probably be talking a little bit less loudly into my microphone. We'll see. But this is Freud. This is another one of Freud's theories. Really, all three of these are Freudian in the sense that there's this aversive conflict between some kind of conscious rationality and unconscious latent thing that won't go away. And the key insight here is that childhood development is really strongly emphasized because of the way that you'll see what I mean later, fixate on a certain stage and kind of miss the boat and never get over that. So, okay. These stages are, first, and again, I'll explain all of these as we go. So don't worry about defining them, but leave yourself some space. We have the oral stage, the anal stage. All right, here we go. We're getting quieter. The phallic stage. Now it sounds kind of creepy. It sounds like I'm doing some kind of ASMR. That's not the goal. The latent stage and the genital stage. Okay, we said the bad words. But what is he really saying here? What Freud is really saying is that you have all of these stages that are associated with a certain part of the body, except latent. Don't worry about that. There were a lot of holes. Well, these are all. I didn't say that. But the idea here is that you have specific phases of life based on biological development. You have a fascination with or an important development of a certain part of the body. And given that it's the psychosexual stages, you can guess where this is going very quickly. Oral stage is your first stage. So this is birth to about a year or two. I don't think you really need to know the years, but okay, just for context, up to 2 years old. You have a fascination with the mouth, right? You're putting things in your mouth. You're tasting things with your mouth. You're sucking on your thumb. And because it's Freud, you're breastfeeding, and that's important. So the idea here is that there's some kind of ethereal connection that you're making with your mouth. That if you're not properly accounted for and developed after this stage, you'll have fixation problems because you never really got past the oral stage. So you have these slightly oral fixation patterns. Clinginess and dependence, you can almost imagine like latching onto something like a fish, I guess. And this is key to Freud's idea, mouth-based numbing agents for your anxiety, like cigarettes and alcohol. I guess heroin doesn't count. If you're a heroin addict, you probably weren't fixed at that time. But if it goes through your mouth, you're in trouble. Again, this is a different time, but that's the oral stage. The anal stage. Okay, so this is around the time, roughly year 2 to year 3, that you have toilet training. And this is for Freud is like a huge deal. Because this is the kid's first opportunity to show off his or her skills. Okay, that's the idea here. You have a fascination with like expulsion, which could be waste, or it could be the sense of like pumping out a good assignment. Again, look, I am not he, but this is relevant. This is where we get the term anal retentive personality from, actually. The idea that you're obsessive over orderliness, compliance, perfectionism. If you couldn't show it here, you couldn't show off how talented you are, now you're going to be super, super, super concerned, super conscientious about making sure that you're in charge and you're in business 100% of the time. That's the idea. The phallic stage houses Freud's most screwed up ideas. But this is where the idea is, okay, we've conquered our most base and most fundamental biological processes, but now we have to get to the evolutionary apex, right, which is sex. So here you have a fascination with the parent of the opposite sex. We were going to get there eventually. You knew it. Let's do it. So the idea here is that you start out basically wanting, in you all's cases, to have intercourse with your dad, but you don't know what that is. That's the idea. And the end result is that you get over this inner urge, right? This inner drive, and that you can identify more with your same-sex parent. Now, your same-sex parent is ostensibly doing what you wanted to do, so maybe that's the idea. I'm not sure. Fixation here tends to lead to aggressiveness, is the idea. Especially with members of the opposite sex, go figure. But to Freud, this is a fundamental childhood experience. And after this, we'll talk about what Freud got right. Don't worry. The latent stage. So phallic stage is like 3 to 6, roughly. Latent stage is around 6 to 13. So you're showing off into society a lot more. Your kids in school, right? Well, your boys in school, and Freud was writing because we still were in the 1800s. And they're getting out of the house more. They're actually talking to people because they're capable of that now. So here we take these fundamental drives of sexuality and aggression, go figure, and you're sublimating them into more socially acceptable manifestations. You're changing them in some key way into something that when you interact with people, they won't be as bothered about. So the key example here is, again, we're talking about boys mostly because boys were the ones that went to school. I'm not saying that this is a valuable thing, but that was the historical context. So one of Freud's key arguments is contact sports like football, or in Europe, different football, tend to be manifestations of the aggression drive so that you can knock people around, right? All masculine. You can knock people around without getting arrested. That's the basic idea here. If you're fixed, you likely won't have an acceptable manifestation of this drive. So, you get the idea. All right, the genital stage. This is the final psychosexual stage. In this case, we're talking about the puberty, right? Maturation of sexual processes. And the ability to be a functioning adult, which for Freud meant being able to love without letting your rapacious inner sexual drive take over, love somebody, love your kids, and to work, sublimating your aggressive drive so that you can put what you want behind what's good for the whole. It kind of ends up wholesome, but the bar is pretty low from the beginning, so you get that little upward trend and it's not as crazy. So it is 9:12, as is custom, especially after all that. I think it's good to take a little break. I'll stick around for a minute or two for questions, but if you don't have anything, I'm gonna run up real quick and get some water so I don't voice crack again like I did like 2 weeks ago. That was really bad. Still kind of thinking about that one, but I'll leave this up for like 30 seconds, and if you have anything, just shout at me because I'll be looking at my magic cube. All right, it's been about 5 minutes, so if all of you are here, I'll wait to make sure. But oh, there you are. Okay, perfect. So we'll just get going on this. We're not quite out of the woods with personality yet, although I do believe that we've gotten through the more difficult stuff. There's still some Freud stuff even actually, but nothing as parent attention grabbing as what we've discussed so far. So that's good news. So for Freud's last, the last way that Freud phrased his ideas, um, this structural model of personality, structural. So the structural model is the most famous one. It's the one that you've probably heard of, even if the term structural doesn't mean anything to you. This is the id, ego, superego, right? You remember that? You've at least heard of the id at some point. So what does that actually mean? So you have these three parts of the self. It's similar to our original topographic model, but it's not quite the same. So naturally, it's a gotcha test question kind of deal. But the id is your unconscious and impulsive force, drives, instincts, right? This kind of thing. Wanting to, desiring your opposite sex parent is very id energy. When we talk about the id, we often associate it with this idea of primary process thinking, the wishful, illogical, associative thought. You're not setting goals. You're not thinking things through with reason and substance and intelligence. You're just doing what feels good in the moment. You're drawing associations between ideas without really any rationality between them. The superego is on the other end of the scale. So we have our id, right, on the irrational side, and the superego on the super rational side. The superego is your internalized, almost parental voice telling you what's acceptable and what isn't. Superego and moral compass often overlap. The superego's biggest emotional contribution is this idea of guilt. You feel guilty about something because you know you shouldn't have done it. Well, why shouldn't you have done it? And the answer is simply that the superego said so. Um, when you have these two poles, it helps to have a middle section, right? And in this model, the ego is the compromiser of sorts between the id and the superego. So the ego, the id and the superego are all totally internal. The ego takes in what's going on the outside. It takes in both parts that are yapping. Oh, don't do that. It's not allowed. Oh, do it. It'll feel cool, right? And it's accounting for the reality of the outside world and engaging in a more logical, goal-oriented thought process. So the superego really isn't the one that's doing the rationality. It's more that the id is like the impulsive, I'm gonna do this, and the superego is like the I'm not gonna allowed to do this. I'm not gonna allow. I'm not allowed to do this. I shouldn't do this. This behavior is socially acceptable. This one isn't, and because it isn't, avoid it. Right. So the ego is kind of like you can imagine the parent coming in and talking down the two arguing children, right? Like, all right, I hear what you're saying. I hear what you're saying. I understand the broader context of what's going on. Let's make a good decision based on this. Now, the ego clearly isn't super powerful because the id takes over as much as it did in the past, but yeah. Um, Defense mechanisms are another Freudian idea. They're not really a model of personality, but they play a role in personality. So it's worth talking about. Definition here is it's an often unconscious action taken to protect the self from the anxiety from id superego conflict. You're doing something to make the fighting between the id and the superego seem like it's not as big of a deal. And for Freud, this is central, right? You're oppressing the unconscious. Your superego is saying, no, you can't think that. And the id is saying, no, I want it, right? Somewhere between there's a whole bunch of tension. How do we get rid of that? Defense mechanisms. So there's 6 in total. The most basic is this idea of repression. If I don't think about it, if I push a thought as deep into the unconscious as I can, it's not there, right? I mean, wrong, but that's what repression is. I'm just not going to think about it. I'm not going to think about it. I'm not going to think about it. Denial, you can probably guess what this means. Basically, you're saying, I didn't do that. Or, if you're saying that you did that, you're saying that it wasn't a big deal. You're saying that the circumstance is not as bad as Mr. Superego over here is making it out to be. Or it could be Mr. Id too, if you didn't eat or something like that. But all right, after denial is projection. Projection is the idea that you have your own unacceptable thoughts, behaviors, things you're ashamed of, and since you don't want to see them in you, you project them into other people. You say, why are you being so angry? Because you don't like the fact that you're angry. And if you can convince yourself that everybody is angry, that was close. That was almost a voice crack. But if you can convince yourself that everyone is an angry little shit, then all of a sudden you're not as bad. So projection, right? All right. Reaction formation. So reaction formation is basically the idea that you take this unacceptable impulse and you have a reaction to it. So your reaction is the opposite. Probably the most illustrative example, though I by no means intend to paint this as unacceptable, is the closeted homosexual person who's in a circumstance where it's really unacceptable to be that way, whether because of religious reasons, because of broader culture, and ends up very publicly, very frequently arguing against homosexuality, right? Even though it's an urge that they feel themselves. Again, I am not saying that you can't be gay. That's not my goal. In fact, that's the opposite of my goal. Maybe that's reaction formation. That's up to you to decide. But I think it's a really good example if you have this inner voice and your voice that you project to the world is much more contradictory than that. Reaction formation. Rationalization, this is similar to denial, but you're not, in this case, you're saying, okay, it was bad, I'll admit, but I did it because I didn't get enough sleep the night before and I just felt terrible. So you're not saying, oh, it wasn't as bad as it's not like I pushed the guy and he cracked his skull. Well, if you actually cracked his skull, right, that's denial if you say you didn't. But if you say, okay, I cracked his skull, okay, maybe you could see a projective test of personality here from the examples I'm using. This is kind of dangerous. But, okay, so that did happen, okay? That assault was just as forceful as I thought it was, but it's okay because I was sleep deprived. Rationalization. So you're not necessarily limiting the scope of the action itself, but you're giving yourself a justification for why you did it. Finally, passive aggression. In this case, you have this internal desire to yell at somebody, right? They said some stupid stuff. You don't like that. This is just a specific example, not just limited to more auditory frustrations, but you express your anger indirectly because you're trying to repress the overall burst of anger that you feel at something. So you repress that anger indirectly, maybe by sneaking a snide comment in there, you know what passive aggression is. I don't need to define it. But the idea being that you're trying to convert this overt anger, which would be socially unacceptable, and that creates tension between the id, which says fuck them up, and the superego that says don't do that. And the fact that you really want to hit something. So you just, be snarky, right? Like 11-year-old me. Just be as snarky as possible to repress whatever's going on down there. All right. So when we talk about contributions and limitations of Freud, he actually had the first comprehensive theory of personality. You might remember in the beginning, I talked about all those Enlightenment thinkers that thought Homo economicus, right? Rational animal. We're great. Freud was the first one to say, we're not just going to pretend that this subconscious doesn't exist. We're going to deal with it head on, and we're going to try to integrate both the conscious and the unconscious into a workable theory of personality. And being the first, that's brave, right? It's not like you're learning from somebody else. He really pinned down, again, in a way that was quite anachronistic in this time period, he really pinned down the really pivotal importance of the unconscious mind in behavior and personality. So before Freud, you really didn't have discussions of what the unconscious, it was just the conscious, the rational animal. And Freud changed that. Another one of Freud's key insights is this role of conflict between parts of the self, anxiety that results, right? You're not just one monolithic mind. You have all these different impulses and urges, and when they conflict is when you feel anxious. Now, anxiety can be different than just that, but he's right about that. And he's also right in saying that not all adults are equal. The way that you lived your childhood ultimately redefines the way that you experience your life. Simple as that. So Freud killed those four things. It's actually quite good, and that his theory is kind of outmoded by 21st century standards doesn't really detract from those accomplishments and how unique and pivotal they are. But as you may have noticed, his psychodynamics struggled a lot in a lot of key areas. The first is the way that he developed it. He worked with like 5 rich Austrian women who had hysteria. That was a voice crack. You didn't hear that. But worked with like 5 people. How are you going to develop something that you're going to generalize on, at the time, 1.5 billion people by working on 5? It just doesn't make sense. What if those 5 people, because they're all rich Austrians, have personality tics that aren't mirrored by the rest of the population? You're going to say that everyone has that problem. Overemphasis on the drives of aggression and sexuality. Maybe you noticed. If you were paying attention, maybe you noticed that. But that was a big problem. Not just because it's like, haha, that's weird, but it really was. It really is an issue. Life is not just aggression and sexuality, but you look at these models that he has, and it's central. It's really important, but it's not central. And his lack of focus on adult experiences. Freud kind of thought that once you hit the end of your latent stage or, beginning of your general stage, you were killing it. You could have the most severe trauma in the world, but you got potty trained correctly, so you're safe. You're going to be totally normal. Okay, saying that out loud tells you enough about the fact that that's a limitation. American psychology. So Freud was an Austrian, right? Or his school of thought was predominantly European. American psychology responds by just saying, screw this, I hate this, it makes me uncomfortable and like icky. We're just going to espouse behaviorism. If this is what the mind, this unmeasurable mind does, is just think about mom all day, let's not even worry about that and focus on what we can quantitatively measure. So if you remember when we were talking about conditioning and all that, the behaviorist school. Okay, so that's Freud. I'm certainly open to take any questions. Please shout at me if you have them. Don't let your aggression drive go too crazy. But we have some other theories of personality to talk about. So this is still under the chief personality header, but it's not Freudian, so give it its own area. So our first non-Freudian approach is the social cognitive theory. And you will find that this is like if you turned Freud inside out. It's very, very different. And you can see it was developed as a response to wanting to have sex with your father. So social cog is, it assumes that human personality is grounded in a rational understanding of the world. Grounded in rationality. That's the big difference, right? You saw how irrational Freud thought the mind was. This says, no, we really do have, we certainly have our irrational tics, but at the end of the day, we are rational animals, is what social cog says. So its main focus is the use of cognitive processes, social cognitive theory, the use of cognitive processes, so not affect, not that irrational stuff, cognitive processes, in relation to an understanding of the outside world. Remember, when we talk about psychology, social refers to what's outside the self. So it doesn't necessarily have to be another human being. It could be the weather. But the idea is you're using your cognitive processes to engage the outside world. And that is where personality comes from. It's modulated by these irrational bits, but it comes from that. So basically, the idea here, again, this is kind of computational. So we have ways to predict whether the environment, like the social experience, what's outside, is going to predict someone's manifestation of personality in that moment, or if the cognitive, the inside. An example being, right, let's hypothetically say that you go to a school where almost nobody is Catholic, and you are asked what you think about religion. Well, I don't know if this is true for all of you. Well, it's probably not true for all of you, now that I think about it. But like, let's say you're in a religious minority situation generally. It's unpopular to believe this religious minority viewpoint, but you do earnestly believe it cognitively. How do we tell whether the social pressure to fit in versus the cognitive pressure to say what you actually believe, because that's how your cognitive processes work? How do we tell which one wins? Well, the social pressure, the environment, is stronger in 4 conditions, and I'll explain them and I'll try to make sense of them because they're all that computational psych speak that doesn't always make sense. The current context is meaningful. What does that mean? So if there's something about the current context that has a special meaning for you, like if this is a group of people that whose opinion you care about deeply, in that case, you're likely to think more about the environment's influence. Or, you know, maybe you were thinking about something, but you see a really beautiful sunset, and that's meaningful to you. You're much more likely to stop what the cognitive is doing and just take it in, right? And again, like, what does this do with personality? Well, personality is what you show to the outside world, and what you show is a consequence of this kind of tug of war between the two factors. The context is seen to be self-relevant. What does that mean? So, okay, anything that's relevant to the self. Go figure, right? You could be in a situation where I have a really strong identity about being this religious viewpoint. That's a really self-relevant situation. In that case, right, you're much more likely to go with the side of that religion. Now, if you identify with this group of people that is all rather hostile to this belief, you're much more likely, because you personally identify quite strongly as part of yourself, your membership with these people, you're much more likely to be ruled by the environment in that case. 3 has a really fancy term that I'm going to define first. You're convinced that a certain behavior you do will lead to an outcome you want. That's the idea of 3. The term is behavior self-efficacy outcome expectancy. But nobody talks like that. Behavior self-efficacy outcome expectancy. Let's break that down. Behavior, right, is what you do. Self-efficacy is you're being convinced that what you do will bring about the outcome. Outcome, right? So you're convinced that what you do is going to bring about a certain outcome. In this social environmental world, expectancy means you expect it. So the idea here is if you have no idea how to look like you're going to fit in, you're more likely to just say your beliefs. But if you know that burning the cross is going to do it for you, then you're much more likely to do that because now you have a clear path to fitting in. If you didn't have a clear path, right? You don't know what you do is going to end up doing. You're much more likely to just follow what's inside. 4. Oh God, I hate the way they define this. There's individual self-regulation. What that means is that you're constantly asking yourself, how well am I fitting in at this time? How well am I fitting in at this time? How well? How well am I acting in accord with this environment? As soon as that stops, you're not going to be making these cognitive decisions about fitting in, about bowing to the environment, right? Because you're not reflecting on it. You don't have a score to track your progress. So, okay. That's the basic social cognitive construct. But something interesting that it suggests is that personality really isn't that significant. The only thing that's constant in all of a person's interactions is a cognitive processes going on inside that person. So, you didn't hear that. But take religion, right? So you might be a person of faith or a person of no faith, regardless of the circumstance. But your circumstances are going to differ all the time, and that's going to jumble the equation, right? Those 4 things we just listed are going to alter the way you act. So the argument that social cognitive says is that personality is ultimately not consistent because you're so, even if you have the power to overcome it, you're still so dependent on the outside world. And because the outside world is not consistent, and because it forms such a big part of your personality, therefore your personality can hardly be consistent at all. At the end of the day, the experimental evidence for this is mixed. It really depends on how you measure it. But it's important to realize we're not just beacons of individuality. We really are influenced by the outside world, potentially in ways that we wouldn't guess. I mean, I'm a sociology major, so I know which camp I'm in. I'm in the side that says other people can tell you what to think. But that's a fundamental idea. So contributions of social cognitive theory. It acknowledges the role of memory, which is a key cognitive process, right? So you remember what happened last time you were in this scenario, and of past actions on what one expects to get from an outcome. So Freud was pretty unilateral. It doesn't matter how many times you do something based on instinct, you're still doing it because of instinct. But with this, right, you can kind of modulate what that drive, that cognitive drive would be based on behavior, right? I tried to fit in last time by making an awkward joke. It didn't work. So I'm going to change the outcome expectancy, right? What I expect to happen from making awkward jokes and find a new way to try to fit it. That's pivotal. And, Freud never said that. Freud never got into that level of detail, but yeah. Acknowledges the influence of the situation on an individual's behavior. Well, yeah, that's the entire point of the social part, right? Freud was kind of internal. He's like, if you weren't potty trained properly, it doesn't matter what the circumstances. You're going to be super conscientious, anal retentive, one might say, and that simply isn't true to the same extent every time. And I think that's a self-evident fact that social cognitive gets right. Criticisms of social cognitive theory, it doesn't adequately explain irrational behavior, and looking at the time I spent 3 hours on my phone earlier today shows that irrational behavior is a thing that exists and you can't just ignore, right? So it doesn't really probe the, why do people do stupid stuff? Because it assumes that everyone is Homo economicus, right? The rational animal, always making their best choice. And it places too little emphasis on emotions, right? It's just, we're a thinking being. Emotions, you notice, don't even play in the picture. what determines the social effect of the decision is whether you think you can get out of this as, the scheming animal or not. That's all it is. It's not anything else. So you get the idea. All right, the last ones, this will probably be all I get through, and I forgot that we lost a week of tutoring relative to when you took your test. So I might do a review session because I'm not going to get through everything. And that way I can blame it on something else, right? I am rationalizing why I didn't get through like 2/3 or like 1/3 of the material. So be on the lookout. I'll probably send an email. Certainly not something you have to attend, but I'll try to make myself available to get through everything before the test. Okay, so trait theory is our last. I think it's our last big measure of personality. Is it our last? Okay, Joey, don't distract yourself. You actually have to get through things. Okay, so basically, a trait is a lasting characteristic of personality that constitutes some kind of underlying dimension of who you are. So it's a lasting personality characteristic that constitutes some underlying dimension of who you are. Like, I used to be a really shy person. So being shy ultimately shaped how I interacted with so many different social environments. So because of that, I was less of a risk taker, right? That being shy was a fundamental basis of my personality as it was, and you could see that manifested in all these different ways. Didn't really like talking to new people, wasn't a big risk taker, didn't like adventure, liked routine, structure, that kind of thing. Excuse me. And these can be, these strike the A's, the B's, and the C's, right? You can have a really emotional one, like being aggressive or temperamental, which I guess is also a behavioral one, so it scratches that box. Or you can have a cognitive one, like I tend to be a pessimist. I mean, it's kind of an emotional reaction, but at the same time, right, it has a cognitive element. It alters how I think about the world. So, traits are assumed to prove constant over time. It's not the trait that changes, but it's a social environment. And they bring about specific ways of behaving. Something to note is that despite what 11-year-old me might convince you, traits are not black and white. You're not shy or outgoing. You might be really close to shy, like the shy end of the spectrum, or you might be really close to outgoing end, you might be in the middle, whatever. But the idea is this is an underlying dimension. This outgoing shyness spectrum, it's like a mathematical function that is an input in every way that you think. So this is quite mathematical, you'll see. Okay. The first guy I talk about is this Eysenck. I never actually learned how to pronounce his name. I'm going to say Eysenck, Eysenck. So Eysenck, never figured it out. So you have 3 subdivisions of personality, right? So personality is at the top of the pyramid, and then you have type at the second level of the pyramid, the second smallest, trait in the third level, and habit at the largest, most expansive, least specific end. So we'll start from the bottom, right? A habit is a specific, learned, predictable behavior that you do compulsively. 11-year-old Joey predictably didn't meet other people or look them in the eye very well. That's a particular manifestation. It's one particular behavior. In this case, the habit doesn't necessarily predict how I'll act when I'm presented with like an adventure situation, right? Am I a risk taker or am I more conservative? This doesn't really say that. It's just a habit. There's one specific, you meet someone new, do you make eye contact? Yes or no? A trait is a collection of correlated habits. So people who don't make eye contact are much, much less likely to be adventurous. They're much more likely to be really conservative, not like politically conservative, like the opposite of risk-taking. And the idea is, all these ideas go together so you can come up with an overlying trait, right? We could say shy. An underlying trait that explains all of these different things. And a type is a collection of correlated traits. So Isenke has 3 types. So again, these are correlations of traits. And these are spectra, as just like traits are. So you have, are you introverted or extroverted? And in your textbook, I think spells this with an O. Most psychologists spell extroverted with an A, which makes more sense, but it doesn't really matter. Neurotic versus emotionally stable. And the third one is psychotic versus self-control. So a lot of these types, you can already guess what they are. So introversion might be social inhibition, but also like a super serious disposition, lack of risk-taking, all these traits, which of course predict specific habits. Whereas an extrovert is much more sociable, much more active, right? An introvert can sit in a chair and play video games all day. Extroverts need more stimulation than that. You get it. Neuroticism, anxiety, moodiness, tension, low self-esteem, coming from neurosis or being neurotic. All these different ideas, right? Tending to doubt yourself. Might be a little bit introverted, but it's more neurotic. At the same time, being somebody with mood swings also falls under this type. You see the idea? It's like these types explain the patterns and traits, which explain the patterns and habits. Emotional stability, much higher self-esteem, much more even keel, not going up and down all the time, right? With life, much less bipolar. You get the idea. Psychoticism is a little bit more inclusive. They get ideas like being egocentric, being impulsive and aggressive, being antisocial in the sense of not contributing to social order, more so than the sense of not liking people. Impulse control or self-control, you can guess the idea. You're much calmer. You have a mastery over yourself. So, outside of Isenke, we also have the 5-factor model of personality. And this one tends to be a little bit more widely accepted. So the 5-factor model of personality, kind of like Isenke's traits, or types, has like 5 overarching themes that you can use to make sense of each individual behavior. And they spell out the word ocean. So these are axes like like the previous guy, but they are, you only really hear one of them and the opposite is implied. So for example, the first one is openness more generally, or openness to experience more broadly. Somebody who is strong in openness is likely to be much more flexible, much more nonconformist, much more adventurous. The opposite you can guess, but we don't have a term for it like we do with EY, SE, and CK. Conscientiousness is the C. Conscientiousness, okay. So, this has a lot of overlap with Freud's anal-retentive personality. Achievement drive, cleanliness, order. Trait tests show that Notre Dame students have one of the highest levels of conscientiousness of any school in the country, which means we're all anal-retentive little balls of anxiety. Isn't that great? But E stands for extra. This one has an A. Extraversion. They're not going to give you a multiple choice question. It's like extra with an O versus extra with an A. So that's not really important. But extraversion, How outgoing are you? How warm are you when talking to other people? And also, how assertive are you when you have to stand up for yourself? The A stands for agreeableness, which doesn't have two G's, Joey. What the hell is that? Agreeableness. And this corresponds to, you know, how modest or tender are you? How willing are you to go along with what other people say? Are you likely to agree with somebody, or are you likely to say, that's BS? You may have noticed, but my agreeableness score tends to be very low. But it's different for every person. Finally, the N stands for neuroticism. This is slightly different than the previous one. This can be anxiety and anger like it was in neurotic here, or it can be lack of self-control, hostility like it was in psychotic. So it's kind of a merger of those two I think bits, if that makes sense. So this is a term that you really don't need to know, but it exists. How do you come up with these huge maps of what unites every trait? And there's a mathematical technique called factor analysis and like social network theory, that kind of thing, that I would love to explain, but I don't know. So basically the idea is it's a mathematical way to go from all these habits, all these behaviors, and trying to identify the common themes. So factor analysis says, what are all the clusters? And then the themes are the psychologist looking at the clusters and saying, what do all these have in common? Oh, they're all related to openness, right? And that's where we get the idea. Cool. Okay. Trait theory is uniquely well suited to talk about the heritability of personality, because you could say, well, is a trait heritable? And there are some aspects of personality that really are heritable. And the one that's held up the most with these mathematical analyses is this idea of temperament. So temperament is your like typical reaction and avenue for emotional response. When somebody gives you bad news, are you sad? Are you angry? Are you like, oh, okay, and then you go to the other room before really letting it hit you? That's highly heritable. But how extroverted you are might not be. My brother is far more introverted than I am, but we both had the same parents, I think. So, what causes that? It clearly can't just be heritable. So. Trait theories are unique in that they don't assign an assumption about the rationality or irrationality of personality. They just say, okay, well, personality is personality. There are some aspects of it that are rational, like conscientiousness, but neuroticism clearly isn't. So it's kind of both, which is good because you don't fall into the traps that the other two had. So that was the first strength of trait theory, is that there's no assumption of rationality that you can say, well, what about this? Checkmate, It accommodates everything. There's a lot more insight into heritability, which we talked about, because you can predict from data about a person's behavior. And actually, places like Google and Amazon can get profiles on your IP address in this way. That's not related. That's like conspiracy theory, Joey time, which this is not. And traits are nice because they're really conducive to studying mathematically, to measuring in people, having standardized tests about, right? Like your Minnesota multiphasic personality inventory, that's clunky. There's 500 questions. That's like really hard, right? But traits, it's like, okay, how conscientious are you? We can do that. But weaknesses of trait theory, traits are often self-reported or based on self-reported patterns of behavior. So somebody who is told all the time that he's shy, even if it never really wasn't beforehand, might say, oh, well, I'm shy. So another aspect is you might want to bias yourself to portray socially acceptable traits. Nobody likes a neurotic person, right? So when people are doing this, even though they know that they're just a number, there's a tendency, the same way you've heard about with like politics, people on extreme political beliefs tend to overstate how moderate they are in phone surveys. Same idea. You're trying to fit in socially. So that's a big weakness. The self-reporting adds avenues for bias. And another one is that trait theory doesn't really explain what's going on. So Freud says it's what's going on is that you didn't suck your thumb enough. And it's a kind of a shit explanation, but it's an explanation. He says this is why people develop an anal retentive personality, right? The social cognitive says people think this way because of this, deliberation over what's their best route of action. And that's where personality comes from. It comes from the unique synthesis between environment and person. But trait theory kind of just says, oh, conscientious person, and acts like the job is done. You haven't explained anything. You've just described what's there. You've described it really intelligently in ways that can shed a lot of light on what's still there. But, it's clearly not really getting at the core of why are we the way that we are. It's really good at what we are. But with that, we have reached the end of personality. It is 10 o'clock. I feel good about myself. We still have humanist and existentialist stuff to talk about, which will probably take about half an hour. So I'll probably hold a little review session. Check your emails. But I have to go. So I will see you all. I can hang around for like a minute if you have questions. Please don't feel like you can't ask them, but just so you're aware.
Thank you.